Now, remember how I said in the very first lecture about React, how we built a complete final user interface by combining many smaller components together. And so what this means is that we need to start by dividing up our user interface into these smaller components. So let's now do that based on the application that we built before with HTML and CSS. So for the entire user interface, so all of the app basically will live in the app component, which we already started building in the previous lecture. So again, that app component will basically contain all the other components, which together will make up the user interface. Now inside of this app component, we will have a couple of smaller components. And this is all pretty subjective, but I think in this interface, it makes sense to have one component for the header, basically, then one component here on the side, so for this list of categories, and then another component for the list of facts. And then inside the list of facts, I would say that each of these items in the list should also be its own component. And we could take it even further by also create a component just for the voting buttons, but let's keep it a bit simpler here in this case. So I think this is how we will divide up our user interface using React components. And so let's now start doing that in practice. Now in a big, more real-world application, we would actually create one JavaScript file for each component. But again, we will keep it simple here, and at least for now, we will keep everything here in this one file. So let's open some space and create a new function for a new component. And let's start with the category filters. So category filters, or let's just call it filter. And again, no arguments, at least for now. We will change that in the future, but for now, let's keep it like this. So here, as always, we need to return something, so some JSX. So let's go back to our initial HTML, which is where we will get from now on most of the code, or at least most of the HTML that we need to rebuild our user interface in React. So that list of categories is basically this aside element, right? And then in there, we have the unordered list, and then we have a list element for each button. But for now, let's keep that aside and only copy the aside element. So we will just start very simple here, and we will take care of creating this list a little bit later. So let's simply return an aside element here. And just so we see it on the screen, I will write category filter. Okay, but now if we open up here our page, so our application, of course we do not see category filter anywhere, because how would React know where to actually place it? So we didn't tell React yet what we want to do with this new component. So what do we want to do actually with it? Well, we want to display it right here after this header, at least for now. So how can we do that? Well, we can now write it as though it was another HTML element. So we open up the less than symbol and then category filter and then a slash to close it. Okay, now we just have this problem here, which is the reason that everything got red, that we are returning now two elements from this app. So that we do not want. So there are a couple of solutions. So we could create some parent element, like creating a div like this, and then place everything in there. But we don't want that. We don't want to just create a new element that we actually don't need. So in React, we can create something called a fragment. And a fragment is basically just a JSX element, which will not produce any HTML output. So we just write that, and then here we close that. So open and close, so without giving it any name. And so if we save now, then, well, now it should be here. Let's reload. And yeah, So we get this category filter, which is coming from this other component. Great. So we just linked basically two components together, which is already some kind of progress. Now here we have all this code for the header, which, as we just talked about before, should become its own header component, right? However, for now, at least, I will leave it here, and I will just add a comment. And the way we write comments in JSX, the easiest way is to actually just hit Command or Control/. So this here is how you write a comment in JSX. It's important to have these curly braces. And I will explain what these are in a minute. So let's just write header, because again, later we will actually place this into its own component. But for now, we will leave it here because of something that we will do a bit later, and then it will be easier to understand that thing. All right, but moving on here, let's now create that form. So this we can actually close. We are done with writing the app in index.html. And so what we want now is this form. All right. So we can create another component. And in fact, let's place it here before, just so the components here have the same order as they have on the page as well. And now we need to come up with a name, which can be one of the hardest things in React development, coming up with all these component names. Let's say new fact form. Okay, and just like before, we will simply now return a form element, but without the actual content. So we will then work on these components here one by one as we move throughout the section. So I will just write something here so we can then see them on the screen. And somehow my reloading here is not really working. So it should automatically appear. Or actually, of course, it should not, because we didn't include this here yet. So of course, it's impossible that it appears now. So to do that, we need to write new fact form, just like before, then slash, and then close it. Save it, and there it is. And so slowly we are composing our app component by using all these smaller components. Let's just finish now by the list. So function fact list. And let's return, well, let's actually see what we have in the HTML. So just to make sure, the form is really just this form, but it has this class of fact form and hidden, while we do not need hidden, but fact form we need actually. So let's grab this here for our form and paste that here. And remember that in JSX, it is not called class, but class name. All right. Then let's go to the category filter. So that's this aside here. So that is correct. But we also still need this piece of HTML. But let's leave that for a bit later. And so now this facts list here is this section. So here we now want to write section. Section and then facts list. And this also has no class, so it's really just section. But now let's take care of this main element. So both the aside, so which are now the category filter, and the section, which is now the fact list, are inside of this main. So let's copy this. And we can do that right here into the app. So let's place that here. And of course, then we need to close it. Okay, so if you think about it, what we have here now, so this code is exactly the same thing that we have here. Well, actually not yet. Let's wait for it. So this form is actually outside of main, and maybe you're already seeing that. And so here instead, what we want is the fact list. Okay, close it, save it. And so here we have basically the same layout as we had before, just without the content. So we have the form with this a lighter background. Then we have on the left side the filter, on the right side this list. And so now if we think about it, we do have the exact same HTML structure as we had before. We had the header, then we had the form, then we had the main element. And in there we had the aside and the section. And so yeah, we have the header in the original, we have the form, and then the main with these other two in there. So we are translating now basically the HTML structure from before into these React components. Now, if we were building this React application from scratch, then we would not first create an index.html file. So we would not start with the HTML, but instead we would really just start writing JSX here in these components in React. But of course, here in this crash course, we needed to start by learning HTML separately, then adding CSS, then adding JavaScript, so that now everything can culminate here in this section with React. Okay. Now, one other thing that I wanted to show you here is that since this is just a function, of course, we can do way more than just return stuff. So we can do all kinds of calculations or define variables. Let's say const app title, for example, and call that today. So it needs to be a string, of course. So today I learned. And so this is now a JavaScript variable. So just like we did before. And here in our JSX, we can now very easily reference any JavaScript. So here we can delete this, for example. And so this is where these curly braces come into play that we already saw here earlier. So we write these curly braces, and now here we can write any JavaScript that produces a value. So that's exactly the same situation as before in the template literals. Remember? So we could, for example, call a function here. We could use the ternary operator, or we can also simply reference a JavaScript variable. So let's say app title here. And so here, of course, it looks the same. But if we added something more to our variable, then that would get reflected here in the output. And let's put that back, of course. And now to finish this lecture, there's just one final thing I want to show you, which is that React actually has their own dev tools. So search for React dev tools in Google, please. And then it should be here, this very first result, which will take you to the Chrome Web Store. So somewhere here, there should be an install button, but I already have it installed. That's why I got this remove button. But you should now please go ahead and install this to your Google Chrome browser, because the React developer tools are a really, really helpful tool, just as the normal developer tools. So once you have this installed, maybe you need to reload the page, or you might even have to reload the browser. But then once you're done that, you should see somewhere here in these tabs, and I don't have enough space. That's why I have this symbol here, but you should somewhere there see this components tab. So go ahead and open that. And so here we now get basically a tree of our components. So this is the component tree of our React application. So at the top we have the app component. So that's this one here. And then it has 3 child components. And child components are basically components that this parent component references. So this one references the new fact form and these 2. And so these 3 are child components of app. And we could take this even further. So we could now, for example, inside of the fact list, also include a new fact form if we wanted. So these components, they are all about reusability. So let me just show that to you very quickly. So here inside the fact list, let's create another fragment. And you don't need to do this, of course. You can just watch me doing it. because I will just undo it anyway later. So I place this section here, and then right after it, I can again include the new fact form. So in this case, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have the form twice, but it would be possible to reuse this component in multiple places. So here it is again on the page. So here is the fact form for the second time, and so we can see it here in our component tree. And so this new fact form is now also a child element or a child component of fact list, because it is basically inside of the fact list, right? Then here we have all kinds of other information about the component that we select. And as we hover over them, we can also see them here on the page, which is also extremely helpful. And so we will keep this open here as we go through the section. For now, let's get rid of this and all this, give it a save. So we're back to normal. Let's just reload. And for some reason, I have an error here. So that's what this red cross here means. And those errors are usually visible in the console. So let's go there. And the reason is that somewhere we have a class instead of a class name. And that's right here. So class name, because as I mentioned before, JSX does not use class, but class name instead. So if we reload this now, then the error is gone. And let's go back to our components. Okay. And now with this skeleton basically of the app in place, we are ready to start working on the components one by one.